go ahead and get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome David DiBiase for our Geospatial Forum this week. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Eric Money. I'm the Associate Director here in the Center for Geospatial Analytics. So David comes to us from Esri. He is currently the Director of Education in Esri's Global Business Development Group, which means that he leads an outreach team that promotes and supports GIS use by educators, students, campus administrators at thousands of universities across the country and the world. And he teaches Introduction to GIS and Professional Ethics part-time for Penn State, where he was also the mastermind behind their pioneering online geospatial programs. And he's currently, like I said, with the Global Business Development Group. He also was lead editor for the first editions of the GIST Body of Knowledge. Many of you have probably come in contact with that before, as well as the U.S. Department of Labor's Geospatial Technology Competency Model. So today he's going to be talking about something I think we've all heard about, but maybe don't quite understand, and how it might impact the work that we do as geospatial professionals, talking about the Internet of Things. And so I will turn it over to David for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for showing up. It's a real privilege to be here with you. I was so impressed with everything I saw during my visit today, and you all should be very proud to be part of this outstanding program. And so thanks, Eric, for the introduction and for mentioning my association with Penn State, which continues. Some of my new friends who I shared lunch with today heard the story about how my dream came true in the last few months. My dream was, it's a pretty humble dream, I guess, but my dream was that I would get a chance to reconceive and rewrite the introduction, the gateway course to the Penn State programs that I first wrote 20 years ago. And over the past year, I had that chance, and the thing just debuted, and very excited about that. The presentation that I'm going to read to you today is actually the last presentation in that new course. So this is all I've got, right? I'm laying everything out, everything I could bring to the table, I'm trying to put it into this presentation. And I am going to read it to you, and there's one thing, a truism that students should keep in mind. You may have heard this before, but it always helps to hear it again. Time passes much more quickly when you're talking than when you're listening. And so in the interests of making sure that I dispatch this talk in a timely way and don't get distracted and don't forget anything, I am going to read. So I hope you'll bear with me as I do that. This course, the new course, was the very first course in the Master's and Certificate program. Started with the premise of a guy named Simon Sinek. Has anybody heard of Simon Sinek? Simon, you've heard of Simon? He makes the point that whenever you're trying to convince somebody of something, anything, start with why. Why does something matter? Before you talk about the what or the how or the ask, start with why. And so I did that in this class and tried to make a course about why GIS matters. So each lesson in this class begins with a story about the roles geospatial technology and GIS people play in fighting disease, in helping assess progress toward the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, in supporting analysis and modeling of everyday tasks as well as extreme events, and in enabling developers and app builders to lever the power of geography to inform the public and policymakers. So it should be no mystery to anyone here that there's plenty of evidence that GIS matters in today's world. For example, this economic impact study by a group funded by Google estimated that the economic impact of geoservices, as they defined them, is $200 to $300 billion per year worldwide. And the operating definition that Google had for geoservices didn't even include key business sectors of the GIS industry, such as state, local, and national governments. We know that geoservices increase efficiency across many industries and that they make business operations greener and cities smarter, and that they even sometimes help save lives. We know GIS matter because maybe 1 million livelihoods around the world depend upon this technology. And thousands of those folks show up in the annual pilgrimage to San Diego every year for the Esri user conference. If you haven't done that before, you should do it at least once. We know GIS matters because nearly 10,000 individuals have voluntarily earned certification as GIS professionals. And thousands of students, like you, seek education and training opportunities every year to start or advance careers related to GIS. So summing it all up, there's plenty of evidence that GIS matters, but there are also signs that the world is changing in fundamental ways. Will GIS still matter, and will GIS professionals continue to have meaningful and rewarding roles to play in years to come? First, let's consider whether GIS itself is likely to persist. This guy is Mark Weiser. Mark was a leading computer scientist at Xerox PARC Labs back at the dawn of personal computing. As you may know, PARC is where Apple got ideas about graphical user interfaces like the mouse, among other things. In 1995, Mark famously wrote in Scientific American that the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. As an example, Weiser asked us to consider writing. He pointed out that our lives are suffused with literacy technology, written information in printed or digital forms, and in street signs, billboards, shop signs, and even graffiti. These do not require active attention, Weiser wrote, but the information to be conveyed is ready for use at a glance. By contrast, he said, silicon-based information technology is far from having become part of the environment. How things have changed since Weiser's untimely passing in 1999. One big change is the ongoing evolution of the Internet into a ubiquitous network of interconnected devices and objects, an Internet of Things. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and others project that IoT will connect 50 billion devices by 2020. That is not the clicker I want. This is. What kinds of things? Consider this chart from the OECD's Digital Economy Outlook. Probably hard for you to read. You have to look it up online. The chart compares the number and kinds of connected devices in use in typical households in OECD countries, that is the global north, in 2012, 2017, and 2022. Now, even if you can't read the fine print, you can see the list gets a lot longer, right? As time goes on, lots more connected devices. And I wonder, how does your household compare with the one described here? Gartner, the influential corporate strategy advisors, predict $30 trillion of spending on the Internet of Things by 2020. $30 trillion. Connected automobiles and other transportation modes will account for a large share of the spending, as will home automation, security, and energy management. Gartner stresses that the IoT is not one thing. It's the integration of several technologies that sense and collect data, that analyze the data, and take action upon the data to accomplish business goals. Sound familiar? Make no mistake, the IoT is all about business. Beecham Research is a technology market research consultancy that specializes in what it calls the connected devices market, sometimes referred to as M2M, or machine-to-machine sector, also known as the Internet of Things. Like Gartner, Beecham sells market research reports and advice to businesses that seek opportunity in the IoT. Beecham created this amazing map of the IoT to help its clients identify business opportunities. The map highlights 9 market sectors from left to right: buildings, energy, consumer and home, healthcare and life science, industrial, transportation, retail, security and public safety, and IT and networks. So those are the market sectors in which that $30 trillion is going to get spent. You might ask yourself, what doesn't appear? Like science? The map also identifies applications and particular devices within each sector. For example, the security and public safety sector includes surveillance applications, connected equipment, including weapons, vehicles, ships, and other gear, location tracking of people and assets, connected public infrastructure such as water treatment facilities and environmental sensors, and connected emergency services personnel and equipment. Consider that every one of those billions of IoT devices has a location, and many are location aware. We'll consider the implication of that in a minute. If the IoT makes you nervous, it's probably because of hackers. Many of those billions of IoT connected devices each have a tiny bit of computing power. Hackers who can harness millions of tiny computing devices can combine them to create a massive computing capacity they can use to mount large-scale attacks on businesses, government agencies, and public infrastructure. Cybersecurity threats are also business opportunities. Beecham Research maps these threats in this map of the IoT security threat map. And it offers advices to businesses that aim to sell security solutions. Gartner says it expects many new IoT security and management vendors to arrive on the scene. Lots of businesses are focusing on IoT. Did you know there's even a Geo-IoT World Conference and Geo-IoT World Awards for innovative products and services? At the second Geo-IoT World Conference in Brussels earlier this year, 4 companies were recognized. One of those is called Siwio. Siwio describes itself as a precise indoor tracking and data analytics platform for the digitization of movement in Industry 4.0, retail, and sport. Industry 4.0, by the way, refers to what the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial revolution. First came an agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. Then, beginning in the 18th century, the invention of the steam engine and construction of railroads brought the first industrial revolution. A second industrial revolution began in the 19th century with the advent of mass production. Digital computers heralded a third industrial revolution beginning in the 1960s. And today, the drivers of the fourth industrial revolution include a ubiquitous and mobile internet, smaller, cheaper, and more powerful sensors, and artificial intelligence and machine learning. So you can think of these diagrams as treasure maps. Use your imagination. How might geospatial technologies, analytics, and apps create value from the big data and the big threats produced by the Internet of Things? As Alec Ross has written in The Industries of Tomorrow, if you can imagine an innovation in information technology, chances are somebody somewhere is already working on developing and commercializing it. Tim Forsman is a former United Nations Chief Environmental Scientist and National Manager for the Digital Earth Initiative under Vice President Al Gore. With Operations Research Specialist Ruth Luscombe of Brisbane, Australia, Forsman recently proposed a second law of geography for the fourth industrial age. Things that know where they are can act on their locational knowledge, Forsman and Luscombe assert. Furthermore, they say, Spatially enabled things have increased financial and functional utility. This increased utility, they argue, creates the basis for a spatially enabled economy. That economy, that is the economy we and our children will inherit. So location is elemental to the spatially enabled economy and to the IoT. Location analytics is a defining feature of geographic information systems. So will GIS as we know it still be a thing in the Internet of Things? Or will it disappear like other profound technologies? Well, Esri certainly believes that GIS is IoT ready and is here to stay. The ArcGIS Enterprise Suite introduced this year includes specialized server technologies engineered to ingest, analyze, and store millions of sensor events per second. That's fast enough, Esri claims, to monitor all the sensors and smart meters used by major water, oil, gas, and electric utilities, and to track and analyze the movement and disposition of large fleets of trucks, ships, and aircraft. Meanwhile, leading data management and analytic corporations like Oracle and SAP, cloud vendors such as Google and Salesforce, and established industrial technology providers like General Electric are expected to offer their own IoT platform solutions. Will GIS successfully compete with those or integrate with them? Or will its key capabilities merge into them? Paper maps and portable navigation devices have already disappeared in a sense. They are counted among the 10 things killed by the smartphone. By accelerating the trend toward integration of GIS with mainstream information technology, will the Internet of Things and the Fourth Industrial Revolution kill GIS? On the other hand, recall Mark Weiser's observation that profound technologies disappear. If information systems persist, does that mean they were not a profound technology in the first place? Is spatial really not special, after all, but just another data type? More important than the fate of GIS technology per se are the prospects for GIS people. Will the education you're investing so much in have lasting value? According to the U.S. Department of Labor, the outlook for geospatial information scientists and technologists, as it calls them, is bright. DOL estimates that nearly 250,000 people are employed in this occupation. And although predicted growth is just 2 to 4% through 2024, that's still nearly 38,000 additional GIS jobs in this one GIS-related occupation in the U.S. alone. On the other hand, thought leaders concerned with the impacts of the Fourth Industrial Revolution worry that many of today's occupations may not be sustainable. In a widely cited research article, economist Carl Benedict Frey and machine learning researcher Michael Osborne estimate that 47% of U.S. workers are at risk of technological unemployment. Of the 702 occupations Frey and Osborne analyzed, one of the most susceptible was surveying and mapping technicians. Frey and Osborne calculated a 96% probability that workers in that occupation will be displaced by automation in the coming decade or two. Although the Bureau of Labor Statistics, shown here, predicts only an 8% decline, it does attribute the decline to advances in technology. Now, although Frey and Osborne's research has its critics, their prognosis is generally consistent with a body of research by economists, tech leaders, and forward-looking historians who anticipate fundamental disruption of traditional employment by increasingly capable machines. What does this mean for GIS work? Innovation expert Alec Ross observes that through history, our most valuable commodities have gone from salt and sugar to chemicals and fuels to data and services. Not just the Internet of Things, but international finance, social media, and other human activities generate an unprecedented and ever-increasing volume, velocity, and variety of data. Human analysts and their employers, Ross and others foresee, will rely increasingly on machine learning and artificial intelligence to cope with the data deluge. In 2014, Zhang Jin and colleagues published an illuminating paper about how the IoT enables planners and engineers to design smart cities. Illustrated by a case study involving noise mapping in Melbourne, Australia, Jin and team discuss the data collection, data processing and management, and data interpretation aspects of an IoT-enabled urban information system. GIS plays a role in their framework, specifically for the integration and visualization of georeferenced data. Considering the massive data throughputs generated by the IoT, Jin and colleagues observed that to make sense of the information and convert it into knowledge, state-of-the-art computational intelligence techniques such as genetic algorithms, evolutionary algorithms, and neural networks are necessary. Machine learning, they conclude, will help achieve automated decision-making and provide useful policy. Think about that for a minute. Automated decision-making. Consider this scenario about self-driving cars, published by the philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel in the LA Times. You and your daughter are riding in a driverless car along the Pacific Coast Highway. The autonomous vehicle rounds a corner and detects a crosswalk full of children. It brakes, but your lane is unexpectedly full of sand from a recent rock slide. It can't get traction. Your car does some calculations. If it continues braking, there's a 90% chance that it will kill at least 3 children. Should it save them by steering you and your daughter off the cliff? Now, can you imagine the ethical algorithms that would be needed for an autonomous urban planning system? Richard and Daniel Susskind, authors of The Future of the Professions, foresee that, in the long run, increasingly capable machines will transform the work of professionals, leaving most to be replaced by less expert people and high-performing systems. Their hope is that practical expertise will become more openly available, freeing many users from obstacles currently imposed by gatekeepers like physicians, lawyers, accountants, and, well, surveying and mapping technicians. Predictions like the Suskind's about a coming robopocalypse have given rise to what Wired magazine called the Great Tech Panic. Columnist James Surowiecki argues that the evidence disagrees that automation will take away our jobs. Neither the increased productivity that should accompany automation nor growing unemployment are evident. Surowiecki points out that U.S. corporate investment in robotics in 2016 was just $11.3 billion. That's about 1/6 of what Americans spend every year on their pets. And he cites economist James Besson, who found that of the 271 occupations listed in the 1950 U.S. Census, only one had been rendered obsolete by automation: elevator operators. So if your GIS work feels like this, you probably should worry. Surowiecki rightly points out that the outsourcing of work to machines is not new. From the cotton gin to the washing machine to the car, jobs have been destroyed, but others have been created. Over and over, he reminds us, we've been terrible at envisioning the new jobs that people would end up doing. The Suskind's recognize this and don't predict future occupations that may replace the traditional professions. However, they do suggest 12 future roles that education should help people prepare for. They're listed there. One that I highlighted, the highlight doesn't come out very well. I highlighted this one. Several of these new roles, and one in particular, data scientists, are related to the knowledge and skills you are acquiring in these programs. Here's a witty diagram of the knowledge and skills that data scientists possess. For Stephen Kolasa, who drew the diagram, data scientists combine competencies in statistical analysis, spatial analysis in other words, programming, coding, app development, business, which in general means understanding what your organization is trying to accomplish and what you can do to help, doesn't mean business in the narrow sense, and communication abilities, like those of the folks who gave such articulate demos to me this afternoon. The Susskind's describe data scientists as masters of the tools and techniques required to capture and analyze large bodies of information with the intent of identifying correlations, trends, and causal insights. Does that sound familiar? This diagram represents the U.S. Department of Labor's view of the foundational, academic, workplace, and industry-specific competencies that are characteristic of what it calls the geospatial technology industry. In particular, notice the three industry sectors specified in Tier 5: positioning and data acquisition, analysis and modeling, and software and app development. Do these seem relevant to the future role of spatial data scientist? I believe that if students are able to pursue an education that balances knowledge and skills in data acquisition and wrangling, spatial analysis and modeling, and coding and app building, they'll be pretty well prepared for current and future roles. And of all the competencies needed to navigate an uncertain future, the most valuable may be the ongoing, voluntary, and self-motivated pursuit of knowledge, independently or part of a team. Lifelong learning is a cornerstone of the geospatial technology competency model, and programs like yours that support lifelong learning will help GIS people continue to matter in the Internet of Things. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, that came in at 30 minutes, right? Good? Not too short? I could read the last few pages over again. Helena. Yes.
There were, of course, lots of things that can be discussed in terms of, we have seen a lot of these discussions about how GIS will disappear and then just didn't disappear. And we remember that in year 2000, I think when it was like, we are happy that the GIS is dead and the location technology is actually alive or is taking its place, and we have seen that it didn't really happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering, you mentioned that the surveying and mapping, that there is a decline in the jobs, but because it's highly automated, but what we see is that the more automated it is, the more data we are collecting, and that means generating the jobs for people who need to actually look at these data. So the more data we have, the more people we need to actually analyze the data and use the data for something. And I would like to ask you, like, what's your vision about where do you see we are going with this massive amount of data that we are getting, and we are using maybe 10% of it or maybe 20% of it. Where do you see the future with how are we going to use it? What should we do, let's say, in the education, in the research, to make the data more usable and create probably new jobs and help with decision making?
So first, in regard to your observation about the surveying jobs, that artifact has to do with that particular occupational definition of surveying and mapping technicians. So that's not surveyors. That's the people who help surveyors. And those are very routine roles that people believe can be automated. The GIS occupation that I cited from the Department of Labor didn't exist when Benedict Frey did this study. That's a relatively new occupation, so we don't have a measure on that. In terms of what do we do about all these data, well, from what I read and the people I talk to, the fact is that machines are becoming smarter than people. And machines know how to learn now, right? Computer scientists can teach a computer to learn a complex thing without us teaching them how to do it. We don't have to understand something for a computer to understand it, and they understand it. Computers understand things totally differently than humans do. What's worrisome about that is that computers are more intelligent than people now, but they're not conscious. And that separation of consciousness from intelligence is a worrisome thing for the fate of our planet, I believe. And that's what I was trying to allude to in talking about what would the ethics be for automated decision-making in an urban planning system. That might sound like an absurd scenario, but it is not at all absurd. I mean, that is totally plausible. And I would predict we'll see cities, some places in the world doing that. I can imagine Singapore doing that, for example. Depends on the culture and all. But I think we're going to have to, Elena, my guess is, and I'm an observer on this, I'm not an expert, I'm an observer trying to make sense of this. My sense is it's inevitable that expert people are going to be working side by side with computers that are smarter than they are. And human beings have to be knowledgeable enough, agile enough to be able to continue to make themselves valuable.
Another thing that comes to mind is that what worries me about machine learning, that the machine learning is done based on past data, on the data that are available. So if there is something in the system that the things change profoundly, then the computer actually won't be able to make the right decision because it makes its decision on past data, not on
well, this might be,
system.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's quite right, but then again, I don't claim to be an expert. I claim to be a very interested observer who's reading a lot. I think what you're saying about past basis on past data, that refers to simulation, but not to machine learning. Machine learning, the computer teaches itself if a solution is defined as optimal, and then the computer teaches itself how to reach that solution without specific guidance from people.
But it teaches itself based on some data that we give it.
Well, an outcome that we give it, yeah. Uh-huh.
So if we give them only a limited, or if the computer collects only a limited set of data, then their machine learning will be machine learning.
But what is limited? I mean, how did IBM's Watson beat the two best Jeopardy players ever? And the way that Watson beat the two best Jeopardy players ever is that it had access to all the data in the world, all of it. The way it studied, the way it crammed for Jeopardy was to study the entire internet, everything, and it could do that in a few months' time. It could learn all of that stuff, and then be able to recall it in order to beat human experts in Jeopardy.
But what if that data is not available and it can't search it?
Well, then humans are in as much trouble as computers are.
But I thought, like, you had there some of the occupations that will be valuable are, for example, this design or research and development.
How do I do that?
Those are really the occupations where people need to be creative. So they are really going beyond what is known. So I wonder whether the creativity that hopefully we have can save us and make us smarter than computers.
That's tricky because in terms of creativity is not is no longer a good metric. That computers now can compose music that that cannot be discriminated from music of the quality of Bach and Mozart. I mean, that's just true. So we really can't say that it's not creative jobs that humans are going to be good at, because computers can learn to do that too.
I will let others.
Hi, what's your name?
Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Hey. So I'm interested to see the direction of technology and get your opinion on where you see Esri fitting into this progression. I think Esri has largely moved towards the cloud, has moved towards big data analytics, but has largely created the infrastructure for a human in the middle, right, to run a lot of this stuff. Does Esri foresee that trend continuing, or?
The hottest personnel hiring area in Esri right now is machine learning. Now, the concern, so I've just in the past week I've spoken with the hot new machine learning folks, and their concern is very much contextualized within data science. Their concern is that GIS generally, not just ArcGIS, but GIS generally is seen as having limited utility in data science, and that utility is limited typically to visualizing end results. And what Esri is trying to do is to make the case that GIS is relevant throughout the process. So a technology like Geo Event Server that's monitoring millions of sensor events in real time, that's part of Esri's answer to IoT, and machine learning is a big part of it too. At this point, I don't know that you can say that. I'm not aware that Esri has a strategy for machine learning. I am certain. I report to the guy who is responsible for this. I'm certain that Esri understands we need to be relevant to AI and machine learning in order for GIS to remain a brand. And the incentive there is that there are thousands and thousands of people whose livelihood depends on a thing called GIS. And if that thing is no longer a thing, what happens to all those livelihoods? Hey, Ross.
Really thought-provoking presentation.
Oh, I hope so. I tried my best.
I really liked a number of things, but the slide of the Venn diagram of data science.
Oh, yeah.
I had never seen that before.
Let's see if I can't break out of this and navigate back.
I think that's the way we're training a lot of our students.
Oops, not
to be
this
that
one,
type-
but
have those type of skill
this
sets
one,
and critical
right?
thinking abilities.
Yeah, this is very clever, and it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. It's a response to a blogger by the name of Drew Conway. And Drew Conway has posts on what data science is about. And this guy doesn't agree with Drew Conway, so he says, well, Drew Conway's data scientist is there. And so look here's the intersection of business and programming. That's the IT guy, right? And just statistics is the data nerd. Just communication is hot air. This is really fun, right? It's really fun.
Where's the GIS prof?
Yeah. Well, there's the comp sci prof. And but look, it's the intersection of those four is what this guy calls the
Making it
perfect
all
data
happen.
scientist. Yeah, and he calls it in terms of statistics and programming and business. But you should clearly be able to see how that's relevant to what you do here, right? Communication, obviously. Business, I think, just means knowing what your organization is trying to accomplish and how you can contribute to that end. That's right. So it doesn't have to be in business, although much data scientists now are busy with what? They're busy wrangling finance data to try to make sense of the billions, sometimes trillions of transactions per second that Wall Street generates. And trying to make sense out of that stuff is, and machine learning is already at work at that, right? In fact, we have to regulate how much computers can do on their own because they get so feisty if you just turn them loose and let them make decisions autonomously.
In some other domains, the business circle could be the why. Why does this matter?
It's the why, yeah. So if you were working for a nonprofit, an NGO in Africa, that organization has organizational goals. Or if you're working for a government agency in Raleigh, the business of that organization is to serve the public or whatever it might happen to be. So yeah, I think you can generalize these into the kinds of things that you're doing here. One of the things I like about this diagram is that the hard skills are balanced by what some call the softer skills, right? But they're balanced perfectly. It's symmetrical, right? These are just as important, these two, as these. And in fact, that geospatial technology competency model makes the same argument that communication abilities, the abilities to work in teams, are every bit as important, if not more, than the hard skills. So if you can pull off all of that, that's you're adding a lot of value to society. I think my friend is up next.
So where do you define visualization? Purely in communication, or like somewhere between programming and communication? That's a good question.
Well, visualization, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think of visualization as analysis, personally. But so the course that I talked about at the beginning that I just started off, that course has a set of outcomes that it's supposed to achieve. I think there are 4 of them. I should know this, right? But one of them is explicitly the ability to tell stories with maps. So not just communication, not just being able to read a paper and write a paper, but to be able to tell a story and convince somebody that something matters. That's an explicit outcome of this. And I think that whether it doesn't have to be at the level of an individual course, but I think any program, any academic program, should have a very clear sense of why this matters and how it's going to make people matter, which in the end is, I think I tried to pivot this so that you saw it. Really, the technology isn't the point. It's how do people stay valuable? How do people stay part of the game?
A number of us might think of visualization as analysis and communication.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So in my early days,
it's our way of...
in my early days, I was trained as a cartographer at University of Wisconsin, long, long ago. And back then, cartography was conceived as a communication medium. And so the Shannon Weaver's communication model was the framework for much cartographic research, beginning with the guy who established my program, Arthur Robinson, and others. And the 1988 publication of that scientific visualization study, the VISC study that came out of NSF, that really opened a lot of people's eyes to the possibility that cartography doesn't need to be just about communication at the end. It can be about exploration and analysis at the beginning. And that insight led to a rebirth in cartography, I think, and at least from the perspective I was working in at the time. So I completely agree that it's both. It's made full circle.
That's a good...
Hi, what's your name?
Yelena Vukoman.
Yelena, pleased to meet you.
I found what you were saying about the ethical decision making
Mhm.
was so interesting, and not just for driverless cars, but for data.
Anything
resource
autonomous,
allocation,
right? Anything autonomous.
so on,
Mhm.
It's just such an interesting question because I could see, as a society, we could possibly come up with rules that people.
There are people in Google working on this right now, today. They're developing this stuff with driverless cars.
But are people going to be able to live with it? It's just fascinating.
What are the rules?
It's fascinating, right? I mean, we could like.
Well, imagine the work that you all do. I mean, driving is one thing, right? There's a pretty obvious good outcome and bad outcome in driving. But imagine it's something as complex as what you all study with natural systems and human systems and with cities and environments. And who the heck is going to come up with the ethical rules to govern an autonomous system? And I just don't buy the argument that, well, it's impossible, it's too hard, you can't do it. They're going to do it. I mean, not everywhere. Not everything that can be automated will be automated, but lots of things will be. And there are some big business interests at stake to see to it that the latent value in automation is realized.
Like in sustainability science, the role of optimization is falling out of vogue. We now think of more as trade-offs.
Mhm.
All stakeholders have different values.
There's and having to make those things explicit.
Yeah.
What is
Mm-hmm.
What is,
What-
maybe not.
what could go wrong?
What gets traded off at the expense of something else. There's like an interesting democratization
Yeah.
of the process.
So these,
Make it exclusive.
let's see, these guys here that came up with this list of future roles, Richard and Daniel Susskind, this is a really good read. Well, okay, I'll be honest. I listened to it as a book on tape. It was a good listen. But then I went and got the hard copy afterwards so I could write on it. But they actually come up with that in the end. Okay, what should be automated and what must not ever be automated? And they said that their stake was that any decision that resulted in the loss or potential loss of human life should never be automated. That is, a human being should always intercede. And they talked about exceptions to that, like, for example, how about drone raids in the hills of Pakistan? People get killed without human intervention there. But, for example, they believe that not only will physicians be displaced by nurse practitioners and highly capable systems, they believe that should happen, not just that it will. They believe it should. But they also go on to say that no life and death decision about a human being should ever be left to a machine. So they do draw a line. It's just a pretty far line. Hi, what's your
Hi,
name?
I'm Marion McCourt.
Hi, Marion.
Isn't it already, are machines already making decisions that affect whether people live or die?
More than we probably know.
Yeah, even just if you think of 911, you know, in the way that calls come in, and you can think about how their you know, dispatching is happening, and how that's going to become more and more automated. It's not a direct, you know, I'm a surgeon working on operating in an operating room where the person's life is literally in my hands, literally, but figuratively, you know, any decision that's in routing or traffic affects whether one person lives or one person dies. So I think that line is very fuzzy, and we're all over the place with it already as we become more automated in systems like transportation.
I think you're so right, and there's no turning back.
Right. I mean, to some extent, we surrender a little bit more every day, and we should. But, you know, where's the line? I guess. So.
Hi, good to see you again.
Good to see you. From an educational standpoint, do you have recommendations or examples of how you move someone who is coming in as an undergraduate? How do we, after 4 or 6 years, help them reach the point of being ready for the machine learning and the data scientist positions that are out there?
Right. Well, I mean, the starting point, I'll talk about the class that I'm in, and this is a class for probably the same ones you attract in your master's and certificate programs. They're young adults looking to advance their careers, some with backgrounds, some not so much. And so the main thing I tried to do in this course was to actually balance the coursework so that it was 1/3 positioning and data acquisition, 1/3 analysis and modeling, and 1/3 coding and app development, to echo the technology competency model. And very few students had any experience with coding or app building at all. They were scared of it. And so we just started easy, like, here's this much code. Here's this much code, and what do you think it does? What do you think happens if you were to run this much code? And start really, 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 really simple, and just get people aware of some of the terms, and then I think you have to keep building upon that. I think you guys are, from what I can tell, you're already doing a pretty darn good job at that. But this is not the status quo, right? GIS still, look at a GIS textbook and see how much coding is in there. There isn't any. How much IT is in there? Not very much. Lots of analysis, a fair bit of data, but the third part of that isn't present. And if we ignore that, I think GIS as a field is in peril, because this field the workplace is converging on data science. And we're expected to be able to wrangle data, analyze data, and create apps that share it. I was really thrilled to come here and see you guys are doing that. I'm trying to make that, you know, at Penn State, they've got 6 great programming classes of all kinds, but they're all advanced specialties. Students don't hear anything. They can go through the whole certificate program and never think about coding. It never even comes up. And that was what I felt I had to change, try to change the culture that this is part of this work, right? And if you don't want to know something, I interviewed a bunch of people, particularly people who employ. If you've ever heard of a company called Blue Raster, that's the kind of place that any GIS student would want to go work at. They're really, really super innovative, wonderful people. And the guy that started that company up said to me, any student who's not doing Python is headed for a dead-end job. Now, that was an overstatement for dramatic effect, but I think it was fundamentally true that, coding's just got to be part of what we do as educators and as students. Hi.
So you talked about the professions and changes and what we're doing here at NC State and in other programs to prepare students. One of the things that I'm most interested in, it really fascinates me, is what is the future for higher education? So we work on strategic plans here at the university. We look 5-10 years out, and we look at things like increasing graduation, decreasing the time it takes to graduate students and the numbers, incrementally marching up of PhD students, et cetera. And what concerns me is that could be that in 5 years the university ceases to exist in the way that we know it, and who's really preparing for it. So I wonder, in your disappearance of the role of experts, how that impacts institutes of higher education. Is the role of the faculty member as we know it going to disappear as well?
Yeah, it's highly problematic. My friend David Howard here, we know each other from long ago. He works over at Delta, right? So we were together at Penn State many moons ago, and we had a conversation today about a book that I read that envisions a future for education. That was the first really plausible revolutionary vision. It's a book called Junana, which is easy to get hold of, Junana. And yeah, traditional educational institutions are pretty much left behind unless they find supporting roles. Now, I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that's what I read in the book Junana. I, for one, work for a university and hope that it will continue to be a viable role for me. But I do know this. I didn't talk about pedagogy for this class, but I took the step of stopping teaching, and it's a true constructivist environment in which students are responsible for their own learning. I tell them what their objectives are, and I don't provide any content other than talks like this. They have got to go out and research it themselves, share what they learn through discussion, and then demonstrate what they do. And they don't like it, but it sure is a better class than it was.
They don't like it.
They don't like it. They want to be taught. But I think it's a fabulous question. So I told David this morning that 15 years ago at Penn State, I was fortunate enough to be on a little panel that some education administrator put together that said, okay, I want you guys to go away and envision what is education going to be like 20 years from now. What a fantastically fun and useless exercise, right? Because nobody's going to pay attention to that, right? But we got to do it, and so what we imagined was that in 20 years' time, that students would come to university and their orientation would include them meeting their personal digital assistant, that their personal digital assistant would take care of tasks like helping them navigate the library, helping them find and evaluate sources, all of the scut work that students have to do, this personal digital assistant would do it for them. And that would now be called Cortana, if you take the time to train Cortana. In other words, that's happened, and not that I was visionary, just that that's what happened and is happening. And I think if you read the book Junana, it's a book about what happens when we have fully realized digital assistants who have machine learning capabilities and who know you better than you know yourself. All of which can be hacked. which makes this really fun, right? All of it can be hacked.
Another question, David. So, and this list of future roles outlined by the Suskins,
Mhm.
should we be concerned that just scientists are not there? Or do they fall
Yep.
under this new type of scientist, the data scientist?
Yeah, scientists don't appear there. There's scientific applications don't appear in that IoT map either.
Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I think that science isn't an industry. Science consumes resources, it doesn't create them in terms of creating direct revenue, sales, and economic impact.
Some people might say our whole triangle region is
That's a very good example.
motivated by,
Point taken.
the economy is motivated by science.
Point taken. But that is missing from the IoT map that I showed you. In other words, that company, Beecham Research, doesn't see economic opportunities at scale.
You pointed that out in the pie chart.
Right. Do you have a question?
What would an empathizer, I mean,
Caregiver. So right now the chief consumer application in robotics is happening in Japan. Japan culturally has more of an affinity towards home robots, and the hottest, the latest thing I've read, the most activity going on in commercial robots are little robots that can stay with elderly people and cheer them up and talk to them. Because Japan has a problem with aging population, and the whole mechanism before of that the wife stays home and takes care of grandma, that's all breaking down, and so they are working on replacing that with consumer robots that are cuddly and friendly and can empathize, right? It's like if somebody's sad, they can tell. The robot can tell, and they can go, "Oh, I'm sorry," and what can I do to make it better? But that also extends to. I was almost going to say nurse, but a nurse is almost too qualified. Somebody who can just be beside somebody who is ill and empathize with them, or people who are in counseling programs. And it's not that computers can't learn to do that. It's that it's not cost effective to teach them to do that. How much do nurses' aides get paid? It's not worth automating them. Yeah, Bill?